Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to Alice and Rosie for inviting us to speak tonight. I think it's an amazing undertaking for the Architecture Foundation to keep the pace of the 100-day studio. And so without further ado, I'm going to kickstart our presentation, which is entitled Disruptive Housing Models. It's going to be a mix of our thinking about our own housing typology that we've been developing, but also a critique of the housing issues that we're facing as a city and the UK. So I hope everyone can see my screen now, and let me know if it doesn't switch to the next slide, which seems to be the issue always with my presentations, that it doesn't switch to the next slide. Anyway, if I'm talking forever and you can still see the same image, just give me a nod. I'm Petra Marko, and you probably, most of you know Roger Zogolovitch. Roger is the creative founder and director of Solidspace. I've been involved with Solidspace for the past 10 years and since last year as design and brand director. And I wanted to kickstart the talk to set the tone and introduce us to the theme by quoting Hank Dietmar, the famous urbanist who sadly passed away 2 years ago. This is from Collected Volumes, which is a little book about Western Street, our last project with HM architects. Lots of attention has been devoted to big solutions to London's housing crisis, and lots of the proposed solutions are large scale. The demolition and rebuilding of housing estates, opportunity areas like Old Oak Common, and ambitious regeneration plans like Battersea or King's Cross by large developers. All too often, these schemes take years, and promises made at the outset are broken as the project moves forward. Perhaps this is inevitable with huge projects. I am convinced that a large part of the answer, both in terms of quality and delivery, lies at the other end of the scale, i.e. infill sites, taken on by smaller developers who offer solutions that fit the site rather than fitting investor profiles. So this is really the business of Solidspace, the Solidspace story, which has been in evolution for the past 15 years. Hold on, I'm just trying to minimize this side. And you can see we've gone through a series of projects, each in collaboration with different award-winning architects. But as a client and architect developers, we've given these architects very specific and refined brief, which is based around the idea of split-level living, where the sort of eat, live, work section interconnects the social spaces of the home and is inherently a part of each Solidspace home. So we're not simply giving them a red line of the site boundary, but it's a very specific brief, and we invite the architects to collaborate and refine this model with us and give the building its architecture that is suitable to the context. And the scale of our projects has been also growing over the years. So why are we so obsessed with this idea of the split level? There's lots of research that shows that daylight and outlook and our view of the sky enhances our well-being. And we have seen, particularly during the lockdown, that mental health is an issue for people whose housing is not adequate and doesn't provide those really important elements. And at the same time, by having this series of half levels, you're sort of constantly prodded to move around, so it contributes to your day-to-day fitness. And at the same time, there's this fluidity between the spaces and a flexibility in the occupation. And interestingly, the workspace has been always part of our Eat, Live, Work section for the last 15 years. It's never been as important as over the last 3 months for so many of us working from home, to have this space where we can think, the space where we can concentrate. But we're not, so on the right hand side you can see that gallery space used as a workspace, but it could be easily used as a play space for children, or as a large dining space. So it's really flexible to adapt. And Deborah Sohn has described this quite lovely in her article about Shepherd's Walk, one of our projects. There is a kinetic sense of space between these semi-public rooms. The flats promote an extraordinary sensation of interconnectivity that is frayed with potential, allowing glimpses down to a living space or up to a galleried workspace. So this entire idea is about connection between people, and we can see how we suffer if we are kind of removed from that connection. That connection is removed for us, and our sort of circle is smaller and smaller. And the idea of being connected to other human beings is the most natural thing that we have as a species, and it's not a new idea at all. In the Parker Morris's book Homes for Today and Tomorrow, we found these lovely sketches by Gordon Cowan, which show exactly the same ideas about the degrees of separation in these dotted boxes, but at the same time, the fluidity of the space and the interconnection between them and the different activities that you undertake. So we've been having lots of thoughts, not just developing and about construction and housing, but also about ideas about brand and why we need a housing brand, and trust between developers and the public. And Roger has written plenty about this in his book, Shouldn't We All Be Developers?, which is really a kind of provocation and a think piece to talk about unlocking small sites and a radical change in which we can deliver more housing to more people and good quality housing as such. So Solidspace, we also have our manifesto, Making a Difference, which is challenging the status quo, and it's kind of thinking about what is the trust between the customer and the house builder or the developer, and why this trust has been broken. And if we look at the typical housing stock in London and other British cities, it is the Georgian and Victorian house which are the most loved and most trusted housing brands, and it's not been appended by any sort of new builds so far. And we can also, I mean, it's the longevity, the quality of the materials, the craftsmanship, the proportions, but we can also see how people have continuously engaged with this typology of housing in order to adapt it to the way that we want to live today, breaking down the walls, extending to the back, doing it all just preserving the kind of elevation, the brand, the face of the building, but allowing it to breathe and to have these degrees of connection inside. So what we've been really on the path on for the past 15 years is building this idea of a housing brand. So we think, you know, Roger's analogies, shouldn't John Lewis build houses? You know, we've got this customer trust and high expectations, or in all other industries, but in housing, we kind of settle for the lowest common denominator. So we feel that actually this needs to be challenged, and we think that small developers are particularly skilled and suited to challenge these difficult small sites. So we've been lobbying for unlocking small sites over the last few years, and we've also undertaken our own research, because land is the biggest challenge and is the biggest barrier in order to develop more of Solidspace or any other type of good quality housing in the city. And last year we had a roundtable with local authorities, the GLA and experts, to discuss the specific challenges of small sites, from planning through to delivery and construction. And the new draft London plan stipulates a need and specific target numbers on small sites. So many local authorities are currently taking stock of their small sites. They are cataloguing their small sites and coming up with ideas how to release them. There's the GLA small sites scheme, but on the whole, it's been a very slow and laborious process. And we've seen since 2008 financial crisis that the number of small developers and small house builders has fallen sharply, and the field has been dominated increasingly by a smaller handful of large players. And the large developers are not in competition for these small sites. They don't engage with small sites. So really it's the skills and local knowledge of SMEs who can address the challenges. So just in our research, in our publication, which you can request you can find out more on our website, we've looked at 14 small sites across London, and we've applied our split level living typology onto these sites and come up with 238 homes. So if 100 SMEs were looking at 1,400 sites, you could generate nearly 25,000 homes per year, which is not an insignificant number. So the targets for small sites have been unfortunately reduced from nearly 250,000 units to just 125,000 in the updated New London plan. But it is still to be seen how local authorities can proactively engage and release these sites. So we've been also working with other consultants on small sites for local authorities to give advice on design codes. And we've not been alone in this field. So there's some wonderful examples also by local authority-led housing, such as the elderly housing on the left, on the right bottom corner by Peter Barber Architects in Barking and Dagenham, or community-led housing in Bermondsey by Bell Phillips Architects and Igloo, and all the way to a really tiny small scale projects like the Red House by 3144 Architects, which we know from Aaron's Land, Duncan Blackmore, that it's been a particular challenge to go through planning, yet it's received many architectural awards. So there's this disparity between the complexity of the planning process and the need to be able to deliver housing on these sites. So small sites come in all shapes and sizes, and here's one which we discovered in 2015 in North London, in sort of more leafy area of North London at the end of a Victorian terrace. And you can see the transformation we've achieved with Stephen Taylor Architects, which has been really picking up on the local vernacular, very sensitive to the site. The site is locked between a road junction and a railway viaduct, so really challenging site. We've developed 2 homes on this site, and the split level typology has resulted in this case in a specific way of entering the buildings, which has created this public threshold. So there's 2 entrances to each house, and one is half level up. So you have this really lovely idea of the stoop, which is coming from the sort of North American housing tradition, where you can sit and sort of watch the world go past, but also it's just creating an event and a moment at the end of this junction. So over the last couple of years with our small sites research, we've been also focusing on refining our typology and scaling up, because we want to be able to offer Solidspace to more people, and we want to be able to build it on more small sites concurrently. So we have refined our design, and we've developed apartment and house models which can be repeated and are repeatable. At the same time, they incorporate the split level spatial concept, but they also incorporate our ideas and values around materials, practicality, longevity, natural materials. So we're kind of taking forward the Western Street model, which has been a refining of the 15-year Solidspace evolution, and applying it in a repeatable fashion. Similarly, in the way that in other industries, successful, good quality products have been developed and took advantage of digital technologies. So if you look at the example of Brompton, it is only the frame which the bicycle manufacturer is actually has designed and manufactured. All the other elements, it's as a kit of parts, are from various suppliers. So this is what we're really focusing on, because with our split level typology, it is the frame which is the core of our units, and we've been working and refining that frame and how it is made in order to get to the construction costs that are not prohibitive for us to be able to really deliver solid space on many, many other sites. So Roger will now take you forward in more detail about the construction and manufacturing process. And while he's getting ready with his slides, I'm going to read you a quick, I'm going to first go off my screen. Thank you, Rosie. And just going to read quick inspiration for any architects in the audience who've had different thoughts during lockdown, thinking about practicing differently. From Roger's book, Shouldn't We All Be Developers? Architects should consider forging new paths towards making their own buildings. The gap site is intriguing and within reach. These sites benefit from architecture to unlock their value. Architecture is about generating value, not cutting cost. So the value argument has really been at the core of what we are doing. So we're not trying to cut costs. We're trying to take forward the value that we create with the spatial model. And over to Roger now.
Well, thank you, Petra, and good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, although I find this kind of talking when in a virtual thing a bit difficult, because I love to see when I talk to sense the audience, but I'm enjoying it, whatever it is. It's very lovely to communicate. And I'm going to start really kind of, Petra's explained to you that we are looking at gap sites, and just to give you an idea of some of the way in which TfL, which is a public sector owner, owns an enormous area of redundant sites that they're not using in central London that they've owned historically. And it's quite interesting. This one was one that they brought to the market in Aspen Place. It was secured by compulsory purchase at the time when they constructed Hammersmith Flyover. So here's a site that actually has been in public ownership since that flyover was constructed. They offered it as a sort of placatory thing to small developers. We prepared a scheme, and then of course 5 minutes later they decided they wouldn't sell it after all. So it's kind of like and I think what I'm really saying, as I said in my book, is that the issue about gap sites is that there is a responsibility, a wider responsibility in the public sector to look carefully at the resource that they own, i.e. the land, and to husband that land in a way that actually is going to be able to generate the numbers of houses we need. And I think Petra's very eloquent description that when she showed the document that we produced and the escalation is that somehow we have to get into the public mentality in the mind of the local authorities and the government that their house builders, which build at big scale, are not the only way to do this. Actually, the way in which the city is made, the fine grain, the open grain, the London, the quality of those spaces, the imagination that can come through anything, makes it much richer. And it is just a matter of us continuing to make more of it. I'm also going to show, of course, Western Street. And I think that if I move to this next slide, I think one of the things about Western Street, which I adore and was very fundamental, and is a kind of, if you like, follows on from the fundamental notion of Solidspace, that it is a gap site developer. And what that means is our developments sit inside a red line, and a red line is a red line of ownership. And when we acquired this site and talked to AHMM about its development, I was absolutely insistent that this wall that you see running along the edge of the site was not going to be demolished, and I could have made this into an overlooking of the park. Most normal developers would have done, but for me, I felt it was essential. This is an 18th, parts of this is a 17th century wall. It represents the elements, it's like the kind of scar tissue. So it's like an archaeology of representing what came before. And I think Simon's very elegant projection of the building above the wall. Obviously, we filled in the base, and there's an office in the base, which is also very elegant. Actually, all adds this idea that it gives the development a sense of place. But what you see in this elevation is you see us in a way starting to establish the kind of notion of the brand as being able to describe. Any one of the people living in their houses can describe that there's something interesting going on. What is going on in terms of these shapes? And what is going on, as we know, is the fact that behind those shapes are actually split level units. So each of these shapes actually represent your apartment. They're not just added in nothing. And these really interesting in terms of, if you know the building or you go and look at it, is that I researched the components. These are windows that came from Italy. I went to the factory of the manufacturers. I like to travel to see what's going on, how they make it, so I get the input of what they're trying to make, overlaid with what we're trying to achieve. And I'm very proud of these panels here in the makeup. And they were very simply, I wanted to give them a kind of ribbed quality, so they would actually allow the light and shade. And we achieved it in a sort of a rather interesting way by discovering in the manufacturer's catalogue that there was a small glazing bar that they could actually fix the panel to give it that texture. So ladies and gentlemen, it's the best 6,000 euros I ever did spend. Moving on into the interior, Petra's absolutely right. You know, people say to me, how are you going to include working space in the home? Well, basically we say solid space, live, work and eat comes as standard. So we don't have to do anything, we don't have to add anything. And what's interesting about what we discovered about working in this three-dimensional sectional form is it adds a dimension of volume inside the homes, inside the spaces, inside the social spaces, because these are only the social spaces, that actually gives it it's like it gives an additional quality. You have things like the fact that you are standing in a room and looking out a window, and the sky level, or the amount of sky, is 4 meters, the threshold. Instead of a lintel at 2 meters, you got a lintel at 4 meters. So actually your amount of sky, coming back to, if you recall my first slide, you can see that Solidspace are often working on really rather they're really difficult sites. So what we wanted to do right at the outset was to find a kind of reason why actually it would make sense for people to live in it. So we're trying to get some kind of quality, and that's why we call it light, character and volume. So this again is another description of actually how we see the interior. So really our design philosophy, the philosophy behind the brand, the philosophy that we share with our collaborating architects, is that actually we're working from the inside out. So we actually we're everything is the evolution or the way of making these three-dimensional spaces. So working from the inside out really encouraged me. Now I've moved on to another project that we made here in Poole, and this project in Poole is a kind of exercise in materiality. It's an exercise in making. I tried to insist that, and I did, everybody who made this project was local within the district. So I got stone from Portland. The cement was obviously local. And this just gives full, I built this framework. This is the framework that sits in the center of the house, and it stood there in what is a suburban plot, kind of somewhat amusing my neighbors, and it was there for longer than they thought. And that's the reason for that, is because ultimately, if we look this, I did this with Meredith Bowles of Mole Architects, and if you look at the exploded axonometric on the right, you'll see that there's the solid bits, and then all of these elements, when you look at inside the interior, like the prefabricated or handmade Douglas fir portals that were supported on the two elements, the the metalwork that was made locally, the windows that were actually made locally. Everything is a kind of, in a way, this is more bespoke than it is it's prefabricated and bespoke, but it is a recognition that somehow there are elements that we can pull together and make work in our buildings. And in here, this is I often work I'm a printmaker. I find that there's a joy in going to my workshop down here where I can make some prints, and it's an amazing freedom that I don't have a planning committee or consultation. I just sit there between my press and myself, making what I need to do. And so again, with our DNA and our registered trademark, we've then in the image on the right of the slide, you can see this is an image of the three-dimensional form, the axonometric of this new proposal in East Down Park, which is a smaller unit than we've made before. I think it's 51 square meters. But you can see that on the outside you have a very big window. The big window is nearly 4 meters high. So actually, wherever you are, you're going to get this amazing sense of space. You can see that there's a void. All our voids, by empirical study and by looking at it, researching it, all our voids are 1.5 meters wide. And so you can see that, having played around with this volumetric exercise, we have suffered by the fact that we are very unusual almost in a global sense, and you in the architectural profession would find the same thing, that there are not many examples of buildings that are not made up of horizontal planes. And so we've had to kind of look at this from an analysis and from every kind of way to neutralize the impact, because as we all know, contractors do a lot of sucking of teeth. They go, oh, I don't think, they say, look at that section, and they think, yes, I think I can charge twice for that section. And we, as a manufacturer, saying, no, we don't want you to charge twice. We want to rationalize it to the point that it becomes a simple logistic. And so I think that we've done this in many ways, and this is an experimentation, again, looking at the same East Down Park. And here we were proposing some prefabricated concrete panels that were assembled or held together between precast walls, so a whole precast assembly. And you can see that what we're trying to do is to rationalize and find a way around this actual difficulty, or the construction difficulty of dealing at these split level of 1.4 and 2.8. And I think what we're saying is that we want this to become a building system. We want this to be able to be constructed. We don't think that enough effort is made in the industry at all, in the process of manufacturing. So we want to get completely involved. We are our own developers. We own the company. We are able, luckily, you can see that we don't do a lot of building. It's a slow process, but we do have the beauty of having control over it. I've also got the Brompton, and I think the reason why I'm so fascinated by the Brompton, and I think the reason why this is our kind of attitude towards prefabrication, because what this attitude of towards prefabrication is saying, what do we need to make that's special? And what do we need to find from a catalogue that actually fits into that place? And I just want to remind you, I want to ask us all to kind of think around the actual notion of the catalogue. Think of every catalogue. Every time you look for, say, bathroom or sanitary ware, you end up with a huge catalogue arriving on your desk, or a huge PDF that you're opening up with kind of whatever it is, 500 or 700 different types of sanitary ware. You do the same when you come to a set of window designs, but nowhere do you find anywhere that demonstrates how that window meets the wall, how does that window actually join to the wall? That's not, but the window manufacturers stopped at that point. And what's so brilliant about what the Brompton has done is they've looked at the connection between those pieces. And so our notion, our attitude towards prefabrication, which is an absolute necessity in the industry, is to look at this as a series of small components that go together to make the whole. And here we are now back in the section of this project at East Down Park. And what you can see here is that we found a way of offsetting. You see that each of these are the access routes. So we managed to offset the access routes, which enabled us to if you like, lodge each of our sections one underneath the other. And therefore the point that I was making, and you can see that on this diagram of how they all go together. So they actually are 5 across. Then we created external to that, we put the stairs and access. But what this does is it shows in this section really elegantly that the fact that you have that very high window. So sorry, I've jumped ahead. You have a very high window. So if you're sat down here, you actually have this aspect of the sky wherever you are. And then actually when you arrive here, when you're entering the apartment, which you would through that's the corridor through there, you then still have this view right the way through here. So the whole thing is giving you a kind of sense of space. Here's our volume, here's our staircases, and this is only in 51 square meters, yet it's managed to create three eat live workspaces. Forgive this kind of hand-drawn sketch. This has been my lockdown Eureka moment, so I'm really happy to share my Eureka moment with you. And the Eureka moment is the fact that it occurred to me miraculously after looking at this and drawing it many times, that actually if we defined our section as a separation between horizontal and these elements which doing the split level, we were really effectively having what was a completely standard set of floor plates, which are flat floor plates. And then if we could find a way of inserting this shape, which connected in 3 points, 1, 2, 3, in this case, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And on this is effectively the grid plan. So this is actually showing that the columns or the walls spanning, and then that's the gap that I then fill with this section. And so we started to evolve, or we are evolving, and this is actually some research work that it's followed on in terms of looking at the way in which we can make concrete using fiber reinforcement, but at this stage we're going to have to use it traditionally. But what this is doing is I've always been this is ending up with a unit here which is either 400 or 600 wide. This is a unit which is a full 2.8 meters, so it picks up the 2.8 meters and the 1.4 meters. But intriguingly, each one of these units, at 400 they weigh 1,000 kilograms, at 600 they weigh 1,500 kilograms. And then I'm using tie rods to act as post-tensioning. So what I'm using is connecting pieces with the floors that are coming in here, and tie rods. So those tie rods are holding it, and this is the column grid. And here I'm lucky enough to find the bits. These are rods, which are the tie rod, which actually you can take up the torque, and these are the connection pieces. Actually that will connect the prefabricated unit to the in situ unit. And I've had these priced. These are a bit expensive, so I'm going to have to keep looking. But this is the level of detail that I like and enjoy getting to actually ensure that the project then ends up. I can actually achieve what I want to in terms of its completion. Coming back or returning in a way to the difficulty of working in this three-dimensional form, that we're lucky enough to use to be able to do this over a long period of time, and utilizing 3D models, 3D printing, to make models to see each of these sitting on a site. And then we can actually display them. And I can always imagine one day when I have a wonderful building, of course, where all the light and air will be able to penetrate it at different levels. That then allows me the freedom of doing some hand sketching to actually see some of the nature of the shape of the buildings that might emerge. And when I mentioned the thing about how we are looking from the inside out, what that does is this system gives us a freedom of the entire facade. So the facade can actually literally be whatever we want. So if we need to be brick, or we can need to be glass, the facade is open, because the facade is literally filling in, because the structure is working, providing all of the strength without actually needing the facade to do it. And so this comes back to something that we've settled on for a long time, really, and that is, if you like, they call it in the office, they call it the Solidspace tables. And so luckily they glue this up, because it is a mathematical system, or it's a system of dimension, and that dimension is absolutely fixed in section. So it's free in plan and fixed in section. So there you can see the section, you can see the 2.8, 5.6, and then you see the drop down of the 4.2 or the 7. So you are seeing this section, which is 2.8 and 1.4, i.e. this is the half level that lies between these two other sections. And what that discipline has enabled us to really test this model to see how it works on lots of different places and situations. We haven't built a lot, because when you're a developer, you're basically you're always bidding for sites, and we're always in the market looking at sites. And what that's done is, as a piece of research, it's given us an amazing opportunity to actually evolve our research around the reality of the sites, because they are real red lines. They're not real red lines that we own, but they're real red lines that somebody owns, and then obviously we've been able to bid, but sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. That's the land market. But from an architectural, from a testing of the theory behind the split level and the testing of the density, it is a magnificent test, because it's based upon real sites. I call this as development as art, which is, to me, as an architect and developer, and I'm both. I've been a developer now for over 30 years, and I think the issue to me is that I believe that that you can make development, and you should make development, into an extraordinarily creative opportunity. And I think if you're able to control it, i.e. you control the company, control what you're doing, you're in a way kind of you're like a filmmaker, you're like a restaurateur, you're actually able to see all the parts of it. It's not for everybody, but it does give you that opportunity to control. And in that, there's been a fantastic privilege for us and the entire team over a long period of time to evolve what we're doing into something which we think is robust. And I think it's quite interesting is that what these slides are showing is some of the kind of different mediums we use. And so when we come across a site like the one on the left-hand side, which you can see is it's got a small shop, it's got a gap, it's got a high wall. We work with an artist, as part of our way of evolving it. And what the beauty of what the artist does is Peter Wiley, he's called, and he's actually represented that kind of sense of the city with a reality which is really kind of helpful. And then sometimes we use the same, we use different techniques. On the left-hand side is a lino cut, which is really looking at the section how the section evolved. On the right-hand side is another one of our 3D printed models. And I think this is another part of my theory of the development of the city. This comes right the way back to the first slide I showed you, where we're looking at that kind of retained wall And this belief that I have is that we are only part of the history of the remaking of the city. And in that process of remaking the city, we should have belief in somehow evolving, and I think this is a much more sustainable approach, evolving our new buildings out of the existing stock. And so this is just making a suggestion that actually we can rise above the existing townscape, and we can rise above providing additional accommodation without upsetting the memory of that townscape that lies below. So Peter Wiley again did this image on the left-hand side. And what that image on the left-hand side shows is so evocative of the kind of, it's actually Mare Street, and it's recognizable Mare Street, and it's somehow evocative of the fact that a new building there could sit above that, occupying the airspace. And I'd like to finish this talk with a print I made recently. And I think in these very odd or weird times, it's very easy for us to lose our way. We are facing a future that we can't kind of identify. But I think it's a challenge that as architects, and as architects that imagine with imagination, it's a challenge that a city like London that has suffered so badly with from COVID-19, I suffered in terms of the amount of deaths because of the density and the nervousness of how people are going to repopulate the city. It does give us an opportunity for some fresh thinking, from imagination that we as architects can bring. And I feel therefore we don't need to worry about the future. We just need to go on imagining it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Roger. Thank you both. Roger, maybe if you unshare your screen. Exactly. So guys, do pitch questions in the chat box, or just put your name in the chat box and I'll come to you. I can see there's a good one already there. But maybe if I can just kick off. Could you say something about how the market has responded to this product, maybe in different locations? Has it always been straightforward to make these projects kind of stack up? I mean, I noticed apart from the pool project, nearly everything, I think everything you've done is in central London. Could you imagine this is a sort of model that, you know, could have application elsewhere?
If I answer that, Ellis, it is all our projects up to now have been in sort of prime locations, and what's interesting is that they have attracted a premium, and they've attracted a premium from the kind of rarity factor and the quality of what it is that we make. Now that premium often is actually premium after we sold the site, so obviously it's premium for people who own it and then go on to sell it. Say we have two of our apartments in Weston Street being sold again, and both of them have been sold or being sold. One has been sold, another is being sold at a premium, which isn't bad for 18 months in a flat market. The big challenge for us is how do we drive the building cost down? So what I've just shown you is really our ongoing attempt at trying to build what we make out of prefabrication, to be clever about our digital technology, that how we can actually make it, to become more interventionist in the whole development in the whole construction process. And I mean, I have to give another debate about planning, and my argument about planning is absurd. It just at the moment is concentrating so much effort at the front end, where actually what we all need to concentrate our effort on is how we can improve the way we make things.
And maybe if I pitch this one to Petra. Petra, you began your presentation really talking about the role you thought that small house builders could play in the making of the city, and that there'd been an overemphasis on the kind of larger developers. And I wondered if, as an architect who's also working in the field of development, do you think that more architects could be acting in this way? And what would you do to kind of educate them to those possibilities?
I think actually a lot of architects have been embarking or trying to embark on a path to becoming architect developers. So I think there's a lot of interest in that. And I think a number of architecture schools are looking to provide courses that kind of mesh up architecture with development, or kind of a different take on part 3. And I think the attraction is what Roger mentioned. It's being able to control the process in its entirety, but also see, you know, the project right from the start, before the design even starts to emerge, and then right through after it's completed, through to sales and marketing. And I think that's been a really interesting journey for me to having experienced it with Solidspace, and actually having done my part 3 on Stapleton Hall project as a development manager. So I've gone through my part 3, not as an architect, but I qualified as an architect through working within an architect developer organization. So, but maybe just going back on one point to the first question, I think Solidspace is suitable to other locations and out of like sort of more suburban locations. And we are, in fact, in one of the slides I showed, the house and the apartment model and the row house model is something that we really are talking to a number of potential partners. And we have a timber frame manufacturer partner. So we are looking at kind of scaling up the suburban row house typology as well. And actually on the pilot project that we are doing at the moment in Lewisham, Heather Green, it is a very different context in terms of the land values and in terms of the sales and rental values in that area. So that's a big challenge for us, and it's really a trial for us on the cost and construction front. So we're absolutely kind of embarking on trying to venture outside of the usual zones, because London is so extremely competitive, especially on those prime locations.
Now, as you can see, I'm in my back bedroom, having moved my study from the staircase that I previously shared with my partner. Here's the study down below. So the Matthew Montague Pollock's question is one that I was wondering about too. Matthew, I'm going to unmute you. No. I'm going to have to ask it if he doesn't pick up. Oh, here you go.
Shall I ask it?
Please.
Yeah, it's just the noise factor. I mean, I lived for a long time in the Philippines, and the houses which were built before aircon was invented were often continuous spaces. There were separations inside, but they allowed the air to flow to cool the thing all the way through. And there was no glass in the windows in those early houses. So the result of this, in a way it was nice, but the result of this was that you heard what everyone else in the house was doing. And it looks a bit as if the same is going to happen in your houses, that you're always going to hear the noise of other people. I mean, I see the workspace is sort of looking down at the living space, I think. So there's probably a sense of lack of privacy, but also noise. Yeah. So that's my question.
Particularly in the period of Zoom, I think this has become a bit of an issue for various couples that I know.
I'll answer it. I mean, we spend a lot of time and effort in thinking about how noise moves around the space. The bedrooms are always there are rooms. Bedrooms exist in most of our buildings, which actually have our bedrooms with doors on them. And I think that the theory and the practice that we use is to find materials that absorb sound or break up the sound. So if we use concrete, we take a lot of care in terms of how that finished. When we looked inside the houseboat, that was a retardant, and therefore there's an exposed aggregate which then moves the sound waves around. Also, if you looked in that same house, there is some slats on the wall which are timber slats. Behind those slats is 12 millimeters of neoprene. So the neoprene again absorbs the sound waves. So what we're looking at with sound is actually looking at the science of the waves. Lots of traditional buildings have very hard surfaces like plasterboard, which don't do anything to absorb any of those sound waves, and therefore they repeat and come back to them. So we can't, the one thing I can't do, and one thing that has come back to bite me a bit, which I will admit freely to, is when you have a telly inside a space in that in anywhere, and you're got the sound of the telly or a Zoom call, then it's you can't really isolate that. So that's just the nature of the way things are. But what is interesting is that inside that house in Poole, that is a holiday rental, and we often have people who rent it who have different ages of families, so they go from their grandparents down to the toddlers. And what's interesting is every part of that family can work at every different level, and so they feel as if they're kind of part of the same community, but they're actually happily kind of working in their own space. It works really well.
Let's have Rebecca Calbful. I'm going to unmute you.
Hello. Yeah, I guess I just had a question that was sort of answered, and it was about the use of kind of a lot of the images, quite heavy concrete frames, and whether you'd explored timber alternatives, if that's something that would be workable, or if the split level kind of form of the typology just kind of prevents that.
Well, I can let Petra answer, but I mean, from my point of view, yes, the two things that we're doing, the reason for the concrete is obviously it's sculptural, but also it has thermal mass. And so to my mind, one of the things that we're trying to achieve, it has thermal mass, it's a fireproof material. And that thermal mass means that we can stabilize the temperatures inside the buildings, which I think is a really, really important point, to within a plus or minus 3 degrees. And concrete, although it's deemed to be a kind of non-sustainable material, there's a lot of work going on in a scientific level to do zero carbon concrete. And therefore, I still find a lot of argument for concrete. It doesn't mean that we're not building in timber, and Petra's quite right in talking about where we're building lower rise, i.e. we're talking houses, we're using timber. But in my philosophy about making things simple in construction, I want to use a material that I can use only once. And the advice, so wherever we're using a wall, if I was to change to CLT, I would have to layer it with another layer for fire, another layer for sound. And that to me is an inefficiency that I don't think we can afford in the scarcity of materials we face. Petra, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, just to maybe say that on Western Street or anywhere we use concrete, we do cement replacement. So I think it was 50% GGBS replacement on Western Street, and offsetting the carbon, but also it has the benefit that it makes the color of the concrete particularly lovely. But it's really when you enter these apartments on Western Street, the acoustics and the sort of thermal mass. I mean, it's just how cool they are in the summer, and then how they keep the warmth in the winter, and it's just like this amazing tranquility. So if you step in and nobody's talking, it has really, really lovely kind of atmosphere. So I think, and also what we are in the business of is we're making buildings for a very long time. So we'd like to think that a project like Western Street will stand for 100 years, which you can't say about very many new house building projects. So I think there is an argument, yes, we want to do as much as possible to offset carbon, but there's an argument also about longevity and durability, and what is the legacy of the work that we leave.
Now I've got a Mr. or a Miss or a Mrs. AD Mobile, but maybe this is a good one for Petra too. Hang on, I'll mute. You there?
Yes, I am. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Just I was interested when you talked about testing your designs out on sites, and some of the sites you don't get, but it leads to a body of research that you have on how you kind of develop sites. but just then, I suppose following from that is like, how many of those sites do you bid on, and how do you find them? And then, are you finding sites that other people haven't even discovered yet, and you're kind of the first to find them?
Yes, so we look for sites through all channels because it's really hard and takes a really long time. So we look at auctions, we go through agents, we bid for the GLA Small Sites program, which started, I think, 2 years ago. So the GLA has been putting out batches of small sites. Most of them have been TfL sites. We've had a small team who were cycling around and we ourselves cycle around and look for sites. So, you know, we approach people of markets, you know, just when we spot something interesting. So really, we look on all fronts because as a small developer, we have to sort of stagger our land pipeline, and that's a really tricky thing. The land is really the most tricky thing to crack.
I think it's fair to say what I was trying to make the point was that we look, because of the nature of what we're doing, because we're looking at these as architectural, we can't bid for a site till we've actually done a design on it. We don't involve architects at that stage because it would be unfair if we do that work in-house. And so therefore what I'm saying is it's a very heavily abortive project. We might be lucky and get one site in 10. We might be less lucky and get one site in 15. So what it means is that those other 9 sites or those other 14 sites are sites that we've evolved a concept to sufficient level that we can actually put a bid together, which means we have to do a development appraisal, we have to work out what costs are, what the values are. And development appraisals is what you need to learn to do as a developer, and architects are very good at development appraisals. Excel is a brilliant tool.
Last question of the night goes to Karen Templin, who's speaking in our program, I think next week.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, no, I'm speaking tomorrow actually on the Manson block. Yes. No, I just had a question about because we keep hearing, obviously, from architects and urbanists about the changes we see coming as a result of COVID-19, but from whether it's that the need for office space is going to have because everybody's going to be working from home, or that we need double the space because we need more distancing, or people are going to be moving out to the centers, etc. But from a developer's point of view, I mean, what changes do you think may or may not happen as a result of COVID? Because obviously you're planning for a future that is beyond the 2 to 3 years that we might, hopefully it's only that long, be suffering from this. So what changes, if any, do you see, you know, having an effect by the COVID on the built environment and from as a development model?
I think that's a really fascinating, if I may answer, I think it's a fascinating question. And I suppose it's very difficult to rub your crystal ball, but I think that what I feel is that actually our health has suddenly been a great threat. And I think that also the space that we occupy, we've talked about social distancing in the outside, but the space that we occupy inside needs to have a kind of openness that we don't have in our current housing stock. I think it needs to have air, it needs to have light, it needs to have access to the outside. We're going to be, in a way, working much more externally, al fresco. I think we've, in a way, got used to buildings that are kind of hermetically sealed and entirely reliant on different types of mechanical systems. I think we've got used to buildings where toxins are built into the materials that we're using in terms of the manufacturing process. And I think we're going to have to look completely afresh at exactly the healthiness of the space that we occupy. And that's why we feel so positively that Solidspace, in terms of a volumetric approach, a high ceiling, big windows, good ventilation, is actually a kind of appropriate. I think the issue as far as the city is concerned is whether you're going to see the kind of the exodus from the center of the city to the suburbs, whether you're going to see exodus out to the 1 hour commute, whether you're going to see different types of housing model evolve, and whether you're going to see what you're going to see to happen to the huge amount of offices that are based in central London, and whether those offices can be sustained or whether they will actually become a kind of another abandoned building, which will then give us more opportunity to recycle them into something else. So that's why I say at the end, it's a challenge, and thank you for a really good question.